Right, on to chapter 44. Mrs. Beamish fights back. While Bert was slipping out of the city gates, Mrs. Beamish was being shunted into a cell, but in the dungeons by Lord Spittleworth. A cracked, reedy voice nearby sang the national anthem in time to hammer blows. "Be quiet!" bellowed Spittleworth towards the wall. The singing stopped. "When I finish this foot, my lord," said the broken voice, "will you let me see my daughter?" Yes, you'll see your daughter," Spittleworth called back, rolling his eyes. "Now be quiet, because I want to talk to your neighbour." "Well, before you get started, my lord," said Mrs. Beamish, "I've got a few things I want to say to you." Spittleworth and Ploon stared at the plump little woman. Never had they placed anyone in the dungeons who looked so proud and unconcerned at being slung in this dark, cold place. Spittleworth was reminded of lazy Islander, who was still shut up in his library and still refusing to marry him. He'd never imagined a cook could look as haughty as a lady. "Firstly," said Mrs. Beamish, "if you kill me, the king will know. He'll notice I'm not making his pastries. He can taste the difference." "That's true," said Spittleworth with a cruel smile. "However, the king will believe you've been killed by the Ichabod. He'll simply have to get used to his pastries tasting different, won't he?" "My house lies in the shadow of the palace walls," countered Mrs. Beamish. "It will be impossible to fake an Ichabod attack without waking up 100 witnesses." "That's easily solved," said Spittleworth. "We'll say you were foolish enough to take a night-time stroll down by the banks of the River Flumer where the Ichabod was having a drink." "Which might have worked," said Mrs. Beamish, making up a story off the top of her head, "if I hadn't left certain instructions to be carried out if word gets out that I have been killed by the Ichabod." "What instructions, and whom have you given them to?" said Flapoon. "Her son, I dare say," said Spittleworth, "but he'll soon be in our power. Make a note, Flapoon. We only kill the cook once we've killed her son." "In the meantime," said Mrs. Beamish, pretending she hadn't felt an icy stab of terror at the thought of Bert falling into Spittleworth's hand, "you might as well equip this cell properly with a stove and all my regular implements, so I can keep making cakes for the king." "Yes, why not?" said Spittleworth slowly. "We all enjoy your pastries, Mrs. Beamish. You may continue to cook for the king until your son is caught." "Good," said Mrs. Beamish, "but I'm going to need assistance. I suggest I train up some of my fellow prisoners who can at least whisk the egg whites and line my baking trays." "That will require you to feed the poor fellows a little more. I noticed as you marched me through here that some of them look like skeletons. I can't have them eating all my raw ingredients because they're starving. And lastly," said Mrs. Beamish, giving us a sweeping glance, "I shall need a comfortable bed and some clean blankets if I'm going to get enough sleep to produce cakes of the quality the king demands. It's his birthday coming up too, and he'll be expecting something very special." Spittleworth eyed the most surprising captive for a moment or two, then said, "Doesn't it alarm you, madam, to think you and your child will soon be dead?" "Oh, if there's one thing you learn at cookery school," said Mrs. Beamish with a shrug, "burn crusts and soggy bases happen to the rest of us. Roll up your sleeves and start something else, I say. No point moaning over what you can't fix." As Spittleworth couldn't think of a good retort to this, he beckoned to Flapoon, and the two lords left the cell, the door clanging shut behind them. As soon as they'd gone, Mrs. Beamish stopped pretending to be brave and dropped down onto a hard bed, which was the only piece of furniture in the cell. She was shaking all over, and for a moment she was afraid she was going to have hysterics. However, a woman didn't rise to be in charge of the king's kitchens in a city of the finest pastry makers on earth without being able to manage her own nerves. Mrs. Beamish took a deep, steadying breath, and then, hearing the reedy voice next door break into the national anthem again, she pressed her ear to the wall and began to listen for the place where the noise was coming into her cell. At last she found a crack near the ceiling. Standing on her bed, she called softly, Dan Dovetail, I know that's you. This is Bertha Beamish." But the broken voice only continued to sing. Mrs. Dovetail, where are we up to? Mrs. Beamish, rather, not Mrs. Dovetail, sat back down on her bed and with sticks are really in the way. Sat back down onto her bed, wrapped her arms around herself, closed her eyes and prayed with every part of her aching heart that wherever Bert was, he was safe. Chapter 45. Bert in Jeroboam. At first, Bert didn't realise the whole of Cornucopia had been warned by Lord Spittleworth to watch out for him. Following the guard's advice at the city gates, he kept to the he kept to the country lanes and back roads. He'd never been as far north as Jeroboam, but by roughly following the course of the river Flumer, he knew he must be travelling in the right direction. Hair matted and shoes clogged with mud, he walked across ploughed fields and slept in ditches. Not until he sneaked into Kurtzburg on the third night to try and find something to eat did he come face to face for the first time with a picture of himself on a wanted poster taped up in the cheesemonger's window. Luckily, the drawing of a neat, smiling young man looked nothing like the reflection of a grubby tramp he saw staring out of the dark glass beside it. Nevertheless, it was a shock to see that there was a reward of 100 ducats on his head, dead or alive. Bert hurried... Sorry, everyone, there's a cat trying to sit on me. Bert hurried on through the dark streets, passing skinny dogs and boarded-up windows. Once or twice he came across other grubby, ragged people who were also foraging the bins. At last he managed to retrieve a lump of hard and slightly mouldy cheese before anyone else could grab it. After taking a drink of rainwater from a barrel behind a disused dairy, he hurried back out of Kurtzburg and returned to the country roads. All the time he worked, Bert's thought kept scurrying back to his mother. They won't kill her, he told himself over and over. They'll never kill her. She's the king's favourite servant. They wouldn't dare. He had to block the possibility of his mother's death from his mind, because if he thought she'd gone, he knew he might not have the strength to get out of the next ditch he slept in. Bert's feet soon blistered, because he was walking miles out of his way to avoid meeting other people. The next night he stole the last few rotting apples from an orchard, and the night after that he took the carcass of a chicken from somebody's dustbin and gnawed off the last scraps of meat. By the time he saw the dark grey outline of Jeroboam on the horizon, he'd had to steal a length of twine from a blacksmith yard to use as a belt, because he'd lost so much weight that his trousers were falling down. All through his journey, Bert told himself if he could only find Cousin Harold, everything would be all right. He'd lay down his troubles at the feet of a grown-up, and Harold would sort everything out. Bert lurked outside the city walls until it was growing dark, then limped into the wine-making city, his blisters now hurting terribly, and headed for Harold's tavern. There were no lights on the windows, and when Bert drew near, he saw why. The doors and windows had all been boarded up. The tavern had gone out of business, and Harold and his family seemed to have left. "Please," the desperate Bert asked a passing woman, "can you tell me where Harold's gone? Harold, who used to own this tavern?" "Harold? Oh, don't want any updates," said the woman. "Oh, he went south a week ago. He's got relatives down in Shoeville. He's hoping to get a job with the king." "Boys, it's a magpie." Stunned, Bert watched the woman walk away into the night. A chilly wind blew around him. Out of the corner of his eye, he saw one of his own wanted posters fluttering in the nearby lantern post. Exhausted, with no idea what to do next, he imagined sitting down on his cold doorstep and simply waiting for the soldiers to find him. It was then he felt the point of a sword at his back, and a voice in his ear said, "Got you." Oh, I wonder who it is. The tale of Roderick Roche. You might think that Bert would be terrified at the sound of these words, but believe it or not, the voice filled him with relief. He'd recognised it, you see, so instead of putting up his hands or pleading for his life, he turned round and found himself looking at Roderick Roche. "What are you smiling about?" growled Roderick, staring into Bert's filthy face. "I know you're not going to stab me, Roddy," said Bert quietly. Even though Roderick was the one holding the sword, Bert could tell the other boy was far more scared than he was. The shivering Roderick was wearing a coat over his pyjamas, and his feet were wrapped in blood-stained rags. "Have you walked all the way from Shoeville like that?" asked Bert. "That's none of your business," spat Roderick, trying to look fierce, though his teeth were chattering. "I'm taking you in, Beamish, you traitor." "No, you aren't," said Bert, and he pulled the sword out of Roderick's hand. At that, Roderick burst into tears. "Come on," said Bert kindly as he put his arm round Roderick's shoulder and led him down the side alley away from the fluttering wanted poster. "Get off," sobbed Roderick, shrugging away Bert's arm. "Get off me, it's all your fault." "What's my fault?" asked Bert as the two boys came to a halt beside some bins full of empty wine bottles. "You ran away from my father," said Roderick, wiping his eyes on his sleeve. "Well, of course I did," said Bert reasonably. "He wanted to kill me." "But now he's been killed," sobbed Roderick. "Major Roche is dead," said Bert, taken aback. "How?" "Spittleworth," said Roderick. "He came to our house with soldiers when nobody could find you. He was so angry father hadn't caught you. He grabbed a soldier's gun and he..." Roderick sat down on a dustbin and wept. A cold wind blew down the alleyway. This, Bert thought, showed just how dangerous Spittleworth was. If he could shoot dead his faithful head of the royal guard, nobody was safe. "How did you know I'd come to Jeroboam?" Bert asked. "Cankerby from the palace told me. I gave him 5 ducats. He remembered your mother talking about your cousin owning a tavern." "How many people do you think Cankerby told?" asked Bert, now worried. "Plenty, probably," said Roderick, mopping his face with his pyjama sleeve. "He'll sell anyone information for gold." "That's rich coming from you," said Bert, getting angry. "You were about to sell me for 100 ducats. I didn't want the gold," said Roderick. "It was for my mother and brothers. I thought I might be able to get them back if I turned you in. Spittleworth took them away and I escaped out my bedroom window. That's why I'm in my pyjamas." "I escaped from my bedroom window too," said Bert, "but at least I had the sense to bring shoes. Come on, we'd better get out of here," he added, pulling Roderick to his feet. "We'll try and steal you some socks off a washing line on the way." But they'd barely taken a couple of steps when a man's voice spoke up from behind them. "Hands up! You two are coming with me." Both boys raised their hands and turned around. A man with a dirty, mean face had just emerged from the shadows and was pointing a rifle at them. He wasn't in uniform, and neither Bert nor Roderick recognised him. But Daisy Dovetail could have told them exactly who it was. Basher John, Ma Grunter's deputy, now a fully grown man. Basher John took a few steps closer, squinting from one boy to the other. "Yeah," he said, "you two will do. Give me that sword." With a rifle pointed at his chest, Bert had no choice but to hand it over. However, he wasn't quite as scared as he might have been, because Bert, whatever Splatoon might have told him, was actually a very clever boy. This dirty-looking man didn't seem to realise he'd just caught a fugitive worth 100 gold ducats. He seemed to have been looking for any 2 boys. Though why, Bert couldn't imagine. Roderick, on the other hand, turned deathly pale. He knew Spittleworth had spies in every city, and was convinced they were both about to be handed over to the chief adviser, and that he, Roderick Roche, would be put to death for being in league with the traitor. "Move," said the blunt-faced man, gesturing them out of the alley with his rifle. With a gun at their backs, Bert and Roderick were forced away through the dark streets of Jeroboam until they finally reached the door of Ma Grunter's orphanage. "Oh, I wonder if they'll remember Daisy Dovetail."